The Sword of Kaigen by author M L Wang is a self-published fantasy book released in 2019 that has popped into my radar a couple times over the last few months. First, when I noticed it was a finalist in Mark Lawrence's self-published fantasy awards that I'll link to down below. And second, when I was actually doing my recent Goodreads video and I was trying to find the best reviewed books for the fantasy genre of 2019, and it popped up with, as of recording this video, a rather remarkable score of 4.47, which for context is actually higher than Mistborn: The Final Empire. Granted, it has not as many ratings, and it's harder to maintain a very high score the more ratings you get coming in, but still, by no means is anything to turn your nose up at. I would be ecstatic if my book, when released, ever came close to hitting this ranking. So I decided to give it a go. Boy, oh boy, is this an interesting read. I didn't know much about the Sword of Kaigen going in. I knew it was Japanese-inspired fantasy, but I didn't even know there were going to be modern technologies blended in, which was a pleasant surprise. It really was a different setting. I really do believe the Sword of Kaigen is what the future of fantasy will look like, at least for the Western genre. And no, that's not just because of culture. And let's get into the history of this Western fantasy genre we all love so much for a second here, so I can better explain why. For many, many decades, Western fantasy has largely been inspired almost entirely by European mythologies and histories. I mean, it's just the inevitable truth. And don't worry, even though we're seeing a rise of different cultures take prevalence, medieval-based fantasy is never going to die or go away. That being said, as the self-publishing boom has really reached its zenith, we've seen the doors for what can be popular Western fantasy open wider and wider. And it's been great to see. It's why we have the Broken Earths, the Black Leopard Red Wolves, the Rage of Dragons, the Poppy War, and now, I hope to see rise in popularity, the Sword of Kaigen. Because this feels to me like the biggest look into the future of the fantasy genre I've come across in a long, long time. I'm not going to try and tell you this is the most enjoyable fantasy book I read this year, or technically the best, but it's something special. And again, this isn't just cultures I'm talking about, and I'm not just talking about people from outside America helping evolve the fantasy genre. We've also had people like Brandon Sanderson who have done a great job of putting a greater focus on properly and accurately representing mental health issues within the genre, which has been great. And M L Wang does something similar here, where her handling of character is the shining beacon of what makes the Sword of Kaigen work. So there are many themes explored within the Sword of Kaigen, some of which are typical of the fantasy genre we know and love when it comes to loyalty, morality, and warfare, etc., etc. It's the perspective given on these themes that's so different, because we don't often get a book where the two stars, the main protagonists we follow and watch evolve, are a mother with a bloody past who is forced into a situation she does not want to be in and is emotionally just devastated for multiple reasons, and her firstborn son, who has an incredibly violent future ahead of him that feels like this ever-looming pendulum slowly descending towards him, and the weight and the mental just anguish that would cause knowing that's in front of you. And if you had gone back to older fantasy, I mean, you'd have some brave fighter who wants to go off and get involved with the war, but with how violence is presented here in the Sword of Kaigen, no one wants to be a part of that, because it's a realistic look at how atrocious warfare can be. I don't know if I would quite call this grimdark, but there are certainly scenes and things that happen that many people will find heavily disturbing, and so if you don't like those things, don't pick up this book. I actually was a bit surprised at just how dark things got, but I think for these themes to properly be realized, this book needed to go there, and so I appreciate it in that sense. On top of that, we have an idea of propaganda from authority, misinformation, a twisting of history to make a lower class, serve the government to the needs it wants. And this is a large driving force behind a lot of what happens in the book. And the characters' journeys is so realistically inspired from the situations and setting they're in. That's where I really found myself to be so heavily invested here, because I like these characters. I don't necessarily love them, because they certainly have their flaws, but it's because of how real their struggle feels, how believable it is within the situations they live, that you find yourself just, yes, that's what I would do. Go there, do that, and that you understand the emotional trauma they live through as well. The emotional gut punches the Sword of Kaigen lands are so solid, far beyond your average fantasy book. I can't imagine many people who will be able to follow these people through the journey they go through and not feel quite a bit. Because M L Wang has an understanding of maybe not making you connect to the character in the most interesting, intimate way, but making you at least understand them. So basically what I'm saying, there's a lot of elements from modern fantasy and the trends where I'm seeing fantasy go that are this book's strongest suit. The mental conflict characters go through. There's no Mary Sue elements here. There's no just extra morally pure protagonist going off to win the day. This is about people in extraordinary circumstance who have family-based conflicts that are just, we all have family stuff, so you can relate to that, you know what I mean? And this kind of brings me to talking about the book's overall structure, because it's actually not entirely typical. There's essentially two climaxes, neither of which happen at the very end. In fact, about 20% of this book happens after what I would consider to be the book's final real climax. And that's because there's two interwoven stories, something we often do see in grander epic fantasy. One that's based around the grand epic warlike events of this world, and the other that are based in this family we're following. And one set of events really influences the development of the characters we know in the family. And the last bit of this book is about the ramifications, the changing of dynamic, who lands where, who survives, who develops and grows for the better, and who doesn't. And having this family drama next to this war fantasy epic, well, is something of course we've seen many times, was handled remarkably well. Hence why I'm remarking on it. Now, one of the few negatives I'll actually touch on here is, if you look at the Goodreads and the few negative reviews that are there, a lot of people seem to be struggling with this structure because they feel like the book after this point just drags. It comes to a screeching halt. And I can actually completely see where that criticism is coming from, and I do agree in some sense. Whereas before, this book felt like it was kind of sprinting. It comes down in its pacing because what we're following turns into a much more intimate, family-based story, and you can't have the same propulsion through the events in this new focus. So I actually agree with that criticism, but I can't imagine this story being told in any other way. So yeah, it's there, and if you're someone who really struggles with non-typically structured stories where the climax is right at the end and kind of just ends as the typical, and this one's not that, this might not be your cup of tea, because you may agree with these people who say, yeah, after a certain point, it just died for me. But if you find yourself very invested in character drama, and you find yourself very much so caring where characters end up, and you don't mind taking some extra beats just to follow people through the ramifications of a story and the development they went through, this will be right up your alley. On a couple more side notes, the magic system is really neat. I wouldn't say it's up with the greatest of all time, but it's definitely pretty original, and the way it's handled in combat especially, I think a lot of people will enjoy. The combat writing itself is very well handled. M L Wang knows how to balance the brutality of warfare while also making it at times fun to read, so there's kind of this just magic woven in with combat that really lands and has some oomph to it. And the overall writing style from the author I found to be right where it needed to be. Great balance of approachable for nearly anyone. No one's going to feel like this is high epic fantasy that's too smart for them or written in a way that's unappealing, but deep enough where you can go back and dig in and find more through the dialogue, the perspectives given, to really overall enjoy this story more. I think it would definitely benefit from a reread, and I hope I do get to that in the future. So my overall review for the Sword of Kaigen is, it's not the most fun I had reading a fantasy book this year. It's not technically the most incredible of all time. It has insanely well developed characters, a different setting for a fantasy story, and I actually agree it deserves the level of praise it gets for being such a giant step forward, such a good look at where fantasy will be headed. Obviously there's growing pains. Anytime you evolve fast, there's gonna be things that don't quite necessarily land as strong as they could, and things will be polished. I'm sure if the author came back to this book in 10 years, they could maybe rewrite it a bit and have it be, you know, a true amazing masterpiece. But as of now, the Sword of Kaigen is something I really do recommend to a lot of people who like to study fantasy like I do and maybe get a really interesting look at more of the prevalent alternative fantasy genres that we're going to see continue to rise in these next few years. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think of this book in the comments down below. Please leave a like if you don't mind. This is not as well known a fantasy book, so this will not get as many views, and you know, it actually can hurt my channel to have consistent videos that don't get as many views. So a like, a share, a subscribe would really, really help, and I appreciate appreciate it. Purchase link will be down there as well. It's currently free for Kindle, so you can go ahead and just grab that book and you'll be good to go. Have a good one, y'all. Peace. And of course, I'd like to record a special shout out to my latest high-tier Patreons, Cameron Brown and John Cooley. Thank you guys so much, and I'm sorry for the weird audio quality. I'm starting to get a cold.